Hello, Sophia here. This tutorial is going to go over step by step how to screen print from start to finish. So I'll go over all of the details and all of the materials that you'll need to create beautiful, unique prints. So this process of screen printing from start to finish can take quite a while. Even though this video is only about a half an hour long, it took me almost 2 full days to complete it. So just keep that in mind and designate a good chunk of time to this once you start it. But you can also separate out the steps and do a new portion of this each day and just kind of spread it out. So I got this kit from Blick Arts. I will include the link in the comments. It comes with a squeegee, a paintbrush, and an instruction manual, which I highly suggest you read either before or during your printing process. And then it also came with a few other materials, but for this tutorial, I'm just going to be using drawing fluid and screen filler. So if you find a kit with only those two, that's perfect. And then it also came with the screen, obviously not with the image already on it and the tape on it. Then whether it comes with or without the kit, you will also need ink. So I got fabric printing ink. Fabric ink works on both paper and fabric. So if you're planning on printing on paper, you can just get regular ink. However, if you are thinking about printing t-shirts or anything on fabric, you will definitely need the fabric ink, as the other ink will just wash off right away. So I suggest the fabric ink because it works on both paper and fabric, so it's very versatile. You'll also need some tape. So I have this screen tape designated for screen printing, but you can also use just masking tape, or even that clear packing tape will work fine. But I would not use duct tape as it's too strong and it could potentially rip your screen. I also have some disposable plastic cups and popsicle sticks for mixing and prepping my ink. Lastly, you'll need some heavyweight paper, and the type of paper that you use is super important. So it needs to be thick enough to hold a pretty good layer of ink, otherwise it will wrinkle and warp and just cause a lot of problems in the future. So you can use sheets of printmaking paper that come in pads like this. You can also use cardstock or watercolor paper, anything that can hold a decent amount of liquid. So think about like when you're watercoloring, it needs to be thick enough to hold that water without it wrinkling. So before you begin your drawing, you might want to look up some reference images, or look through magazines or books, or on Pinterest, or just go on a walk outside. Anything to get you inspired and get some ideas flowing. Then once you're ready to begin your sketch, you want to make sure that your paper fits the size of the screen. So you want to make sure that your image on the screen has at least a 2-inch border around the image. So I'm going to measure out the paper and making sure that it's the right size and has a big enough border so that you can print easily. So I'm just going to mark where 2 inches off the edge of each border is. And then I'm going to draw a straight line right where I did that mark and cut the paper down to that size. You don't have to cut the paper, but I think it gives you a good visual on what size it should be. So you can use scissors if you want. I'm going to use a paper cutter. And now, as you can see, that paper fits inside the screen with a 2-inch border all around. So I'm going to be doing an image based on one of my previous paintings. And then I also have a reference image pulled up. So while you're sketching, keep in mind that you're going to be using a paintbrush to paint this image onto your screen. So try not to make it too detailed or use any really fine lines, because it's going to be difficult to then transfer that image using a paintbrush. Another thing to remember while you're drawing is that your image is going to be flipped once you print it. So that means it's going to be reverse. So I suggest steering clear from any writing, because that will probably be too complicated. And I'm going to fill in the space with pencil that I'm going to paint with the drawing fluid, to give a good visual and remind myself where I'm going to fill it in. Now, before you start transferring your image onto the screen, you first need to clean it. You can either use the Speedball Super Clean that comes in the kit. You can also just use light soap. So I'm going to come to the sink and, using the soft side of the sponge and a little bit of soap, just very, very gently clean the surface. And you want to make sure to do that on both sides. So I'm going to flip it over and do the same process, making sure to get all the edges and just very, very lightly doing some circles. And then you need to rinse it super thoroughly so that there's no soap residue in it. And then once you're done rinsing it out, you want to make sure you dry it completely thoroughly so you can put it outside in the sun or in front of a fan. And I'm going to keep rinsing it for a little bit longer. I'm just going to cut to the next part of the video. So before you start, I recommend putting some newspaper down or using a table that you don't mind getting dirty. So once I've checked that it's completely dry, there's no water droplets whatsoever, then I'm going to flip my screen around and put it face down with the screen side down. And then take my sketch and put that also image side down. And I'm going to line it up in the center as best as I can. And then using this screen tape, I'm going to just tape down the corners. And then once you flip it over, you can see your sketch through the screen. So now this part is completely optional. It depends what kind of image you're going for. But I want a really crisp, clean border on my image. So I'm going to actually tape around the border of the paper. Similar to how we tape the edges of our paper before we watercolor or do acrylic, and then peel it off at the end, and then you get that crisp border. But if you don't want to do this step, that's completely okay. Often it's not needed for your image. Say you have just a single object or animal or whatever your design is, and it doesn't go to the border of your paper, then you don't need to do this part. So I'm done taping the edges, and I'm going to gather my materials. So you're going to need paintbrushes, whatever kind you have laying around the house. I'm gonna be mostly using this very small detail brush. And then you'll also need your drying fluid. It should say right on the bottle. And I'm gonna give it a little shake first. And then you're just gonna dip into your drying fluid and paint directly onto your screen. And make sure you are painting onto the front or the face of your screen. So that means that when you put it down, the screen is not touching the table. And anything that you paint with the drying fluid will become your printed image. So to rephrase that, what you paint with the drying fluid is where your ink is gonna come through the screen, and that will be your image. So anything that you don't paint with the fluid will be the negative space and be white or the color of the paper. And then if you're filling in a big area like I'm doing, I first suggest taking your sketch off from the back so that it doesn't stick to the paper, because mine did. And then also try not to get puddles of the drying fluid. Try to apply it super evenly, because otherwise it will cause you problems further along. Then once you're done painting your image onto the screen, you're gonna remove your sketch from the back of it. Then you're gonna leave it to dry. So I place mine in front of a fan. And this time can vary a lot depending on temperature, so just keep checking it, and it could take even a couple hours. So once it's completely dry, there's no tacky parts, and you can run your finger over it without any of the drying fluid coming up, then you're ready for the next step. So I'm gonna finish taking off the tape. So the next step is to coat your screen using screen filler. So I'm gonna open it up and I'm gonna stir it super well, because it separates and sometimes gets clumpy. And the purpose of screen filler is to coat all the areas of the screen which you don't want to print. So the screen filler blocks your ink from getting through. So then once it's thoroughly mixed and there's no clumps and it's a good consistency, you're ready for the next step. So I'm gonna scrape off my whatever you used to mix it and dunk it in some water. Then on the same side as your drawing fluid, so the screen is still face up, I'm gonna pour a little drizzle of the drying fluid at the top of the screen and try to pour it evenly across. And then using my squeegee with a single pass, one swift motion, I'm just gonna bring it down all the way to the bottom. And I used a 45-degree angle and I applied a decent amount of pressure. So you don't want the screen filler to be clumpy in any way, and you really only get one shot because you do not want to pass over it again with the squeegee, because it can take up your drawing fluid and ruin your image. Then I'm gonna immediately wipe off and wash off my squeegee and any tools I used, because the drying fluid will dry onto it and you don't want that. Then I'm also just gonna clean up the edges if there's any like pools of the screen filler. Just be careful not to go over your image. So I'm just gonna lightly dab up any excess around the perimeters. And again, you're gonna leave that to dry. So I placed it in front of the fan for an hour or so and just constantly checking until the drying fluid is completely dry. So once your screen is completely dry and there's no droplets of water, you can rinse out your drying fluid, and this is a really exciting part. So use cold or room temperature water and just spray your screen, and the drying fluid should start to come out. And it might take several minutes, just be patient with it. If some parts are really not coming off, you can really lightly scrub it with your fingertip or a new unsoapy brush or sponge. And then once again, leave it to dry super thoroughly. So as your screen is drying, or whenever it is before you start printing, you want to prepare your paper. So I'm going to take my image and decide what size paper it looks good on. And I decided to cut my sheets in quarters because it's the most efficient way, and the image fits well on the paper. Then I also had these weird scraps of paper, and my image happens to fit on it twice perfectly, so I'm also going to fold those in half. So as you're preparing your paper, you're going to need a pencil, eraser, scissors, and a ruler. So there's a couple different ways to do it. You can either measure out the exact size of your paper and mark it on both ends of the paper. And then you would draw a line connecting those marks together all the way down. You would obviously need a bigger ruler for this sheet of paper. And then you could cut along that line. But I'm going to do it a different way. I'm going to fold and cut my paper. So I'm gonna first fold it in half the long ways, and I'm gonna match up the corners perfectly, trying to get the edges super even. And then I'm gonna hold that end of the paper and bring my thumb down to the center of the crease, and then crease it from moving from the center outwards. Then I'm gonna take any hard object. I'm just gonna use the back of my scissors. You can also use your ruler or even a cup. And I'm just gonna put pressure on that crease. Then I'm gonna flip the paper the other way and do the same thing. So I'm just applying pressure to the crease and making it super tight. And I'm gonna flip the paper inside out again and repeat that process a few more times. Then I'm going to place my ruler right up against that crease, and starting pulling from one corner, I'm just going to pull the paper really lightly down, and it should tear super easily. And I'm going to finish tearing the rest of my paper. So I'm just going to show this process one more time using the smaller paper because I think it's easier to see. So once again, I'm going to fold it in half, use any hard object to crease it, flip it the other way around, and crease it again, and just do that several more times. Then I'm going to take my ruler, put it right snug up against the crease, and just tear down. So now I have all my paper ripped and prepared, and as you can see, my image fits inside of it nicely. The next step before you start printing is taping up your edges. So you want to tape off any area of the screen that is still showing that the screen filler isn't blocking. So any part of the screen that you can still see that isn't part of your image. And then you also want to tape up all of the remaining edges, pretty much anywhere that your screen meets the wooden border. Then you're going to flip it around and tape all of the corners of the inside of the frame as well. So I'm measuring out the length of the tape before I cut it so that it fits in there nicely. And then I'm just going to run my finger along the crease and fit the tape in there as best as I can. So once all of your edges and borders of the screen are taped up, as well as the inside corners, and there's no leaks or anywhere the ink could get through, then you're ready to start printing. So to print, you're going to need some scratch paper. I'm just using print paper to test your image before you start printing on the nice paper. You're obviously going to need your screen. You're also going to need some ink and something to stir it with. And then I'm using this mixer bowl and spatula to mix my ink. Then you'll also need your squeegee and some water and paper towels for cleanup. So now this next step is optional, but I highly recommend it. So I'm just cutting a popsicle stick in half, but you can also use 2 coins or pieces of cardboard or folded up paper. And I'm going to tape it to the bottom 2 corners of my screen on the front side. So then when you flip your screen over and place the screen against the table, it doesn't completely touch the surface. So it has a tiny little gap between the screen and your paper. And this just creates a cleaner and crisper image because your screen won't stick to the paper when you're printing. So this off contact method allows the screen to have some room until the moment of contact with your squeegee. As you can see, when I flip the screen around and press down, there's a little bit of bounce and tension in the screen, and it doesn't hit the table directly. Now I'm going to mix my ink color, and if you're curious about color mixing, you can check out my previous video on color theory. All right, and we're ready to start printing. So now I'm going to take some little pieces of tape and I'm going to mark the edges of the screen so that it can go back to the same place for every print. So I'm just going to mark each corner using whatever kind of tape you have. Then I actually took some more popsicle sticks and I put those against the very top of the screen so that when you're printing, you can feel the edge of the popsicle sticks and kind of push it against there so you can feel where the top is. So now you can see I can kind of push it against it and slide it right into place of where it should go. It also prevents the screen from slipping around while you're printing. So you should start with proofing paper, but I already printed this so I know it looks good. So I'm just going to start with my nice paper. And I'm going to place it right in the middle. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and lower the screen down. Make sure the screen is lined up right where I want it. And then open it back up and check that the paper is still centered. Then I'm going to place my screen aside for now, and I'm going to mark exactly where the edges of the paper is. So that way I can just place it back down every time and I know that it will be centered. So I'm just going to mark 3 sides and put my screen back on and double check that it's centered. Now, before I actually print the image, I'm going to do something called a flood stroke. So I'm going to lay down a line of ink at the bottom of the screen, and be pretty generous with the ink. It's always better to have too much than too little. And I'm holding the screen upright so it's not touching the paper. And then I'm going to take my squeegee and lay it behind the ink, and then with one swift motion, bring that ink upwards. So I'm just filling in my image. Then you can start with your proof paper, so just some normal printing paper. But I already printed this image, so I know it's good. So I'm actually just going to start with my heavyweight paper. So I'm going to line up that paper with the tape that I just laid down so I know it's centered. And then I would also tape down the edges of the paper with just normal Scotch tape. I forgot this step. It's fine if you don't, but it just makes it easier to print. So I'm going to lower down my screen super carefully. And then I'm going to take my squeegee. And if you need to, you can apply some more ink to the top, but I still had enough there. And then at about a 45-degree angle and applying a decent amount of pressure, I'm going to bring the squeegee down. And you also might have to hold down the screen. And there's the print reveal. So then immediately after, before you even take your paper up, you're going to do another flood stroke. So you might have to put some more ink down, and then you're just going to push the squeegee from the bottom to the top. And you're just refilling in the image full of ink. And as you can see, I didn't quite have enough ink, so I had to go over it a second time. So again, it's better just to be safe than sorry and put more ink down at the bottom before your flood stroke so you have enough ink to push it all the way to the top and cover your image. So I'm just going to demonstrate the process one more time. So I'm lining up my paper nicely, making sure it's centered, and then using Scotch tape, I'm going to tape each corner of the paper. And this just prevents it from sliding around when you're printing, and it prevents it from sticking to the screen as well when you pull it up. Then I'm going to take my screen, flip it around, and line it up perfectly with the tape marks. And I already did my flood stroke, so I'm ready to do my printing stroke. And holding down the screen with one hand, I'm going to bring the squeegee down, applying even pressure all the way through. And just repeat that process for however many prints you want. So now I'm going to use my smaller size paper. Using paper that's really close to the image size definitely poses a challenge as far as centering it and making sure that your image is lined up right. So I already checked that it's lined up with the screen. So now I'm going to tape it down, take my screen, flip it around, and Again, I already did the flood stroke, and I put some more ink at the top. So you always want to make sure you have enough ink to pull it all the way through. Then I'm holding down my screen, and with the squeegee at an angle and a decent amount of pressure, in one continuous motion, pull it down. And then lift it up and immediately do the flood stroke. The flood stroke also helps your screen to prevent it from drying out, which is super important. And that's the process of screen printing. And it can definitely take some practice before your prints turn out exactly perfect. I've been doing this for a while, so be patient with yourself and make sure you have plenty of paper for trial runs. Then once you're done printing, you immediately want to wash out your screen and then your other materials because the ink dries fairly quick, and if the ink dries on your screen, then your screen is ruined. So I'm just using like room temperature water and spraying off all of the ink, making sure to get in all of the corners and both sides of the screen. I'm going to flip it over multiple times. So you also have to do this step if you want to switch colors. And if you're planning on printing again right after this, you have to make sure the screen is completely dry before you start printing again. Always wash your screen first and then make sure to wash all of your other supplies as well. So once you're done printing your image and you're ready to reuse your screen for a new stencil, you're going to wash out the screen filler using Speed Clean. But I'm not quite ready to get rid of the stencil. I want to make a few more prints of it, so I won't be demonstrating it. However, I will explain the steps. Before you start, remove all the tape from your screen. So first you're going to wash out all of the ink from your screen. And it's natural sometimes for some red and black inks to leave a stain on your screen, but luckily that won't affect it for the future. So you're going to apply the Speed Clean to both sides of the screen with a spray bottle, or you can pour it directly on the screen, and then you're going to let that sit to soak for about 2 to 3 minutes. Then scrub both sides thoroughly with a soft bristle brush in all directions until you see the screen filler begin to dissolve or fall away. And that can take about 1 to 3 minutes. Then let that sit for an additional 3 minutes. And if you have a sink with a hose and a spray nozzle attachment, that can often work best, and it's easier to get the screen filler out. And the more powerful the water, then the easier the screen filler will wash out. And then wash your screen once more and let it dry completely. And you should wash out the screen filler as soon as you're done with the image, because the longer you leave it on the screen, the harder it will be to get off. Also, if you leave the screen filler on the screen for too long, it can eventually become permanent. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I really hope that you found it useful and that you enjoyed screen printing and that you keep practicing. I would really love to see your results, so feel free to send them to me. Also, feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all, or you can leave a comment as well. Thank you again. Catch you next time.